Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Lownie.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's very good to be back. As you know, I've been across the States lecturing and doing other things. And I feel revitalized for our next new series, and particularly given we've got a theme to it.
Well, we have actually. We've got a little bit of a royal theme. Since our listeners and our viewers seem to enjoy royal stories, and let's face it, so do we. We're going to do 3 or 4, maybe even more, in this first little burst of our new season. So I've been sitting here, not traveling to America, but I've been writing my book, surrounded by piles of research and files, off camera, rather disgusting and dusty. 50,000 words in 2 months.
Very good. We've been busy. And it seems that the listeners have continued to listen to us even when we've not been on air, which is encouraging.
I think we do better when we're not on air. I think we do better when there's no new material. We had thousands of new listens and views and lots of new comments. Can I give you some selections? I love doing this.
Oh, yes, please.
So, yes, Mrs. Giddy Diddy. I love people's names on YouTube. Mrs. Giddy Diddy says, we're awesome and do an awesome job, and she'd like to hear more about Diana, especially her death. Well, we may have news for you on that front, Mrs. Giddy Diddy.
We're exactly going to do that.
We're going to talk about Diana's death in the next few weeks, I hope. Valerie Ackroyd has put Jeffrey Posner's book on its buy list and really enjoyed that conversation we had about the Vatican. I love this one, actually. This was from, this is from Marsha Warner. I think it's probably American, because she says, your podcast is my new favorite, informed, fun, and dishy. I think.
Gosh, is she just listening?
I think she means dishy in the American sense of the word, as in dishing the dirt, as in she thinks you're devastatingly attractive, Andrew. Although maybe she feels both.
Yes, no. I think the earlier explanation is much more likely. Well, that's good. I mean, we do like to bring new information, and I think we've got some very interesting things coming along where we will be revealing new information. And are we very popular in particular Indian Ocean islands?
Well, I've been checking the charts, and even though we've had no new content, we keep popping up in these slightly surprising places. I suspect that means like 3 or 4 people are listening. But we've been on the charts, the Apple charts, in Argentina, Thailand, and get this, the Dominican Republic. In fact, as of today, we still are. So if you are that one person in the Dominican Republic who is listening, do let us know, because we'd love to be in touch with you.
Yes. In fact, I think we thought of some way we might do some Zooms with some of our listeners,
yes,
and allow them to do questions to us and put a face to them.
Put a face to the names. See if they think we're dishy in real life. Yeah. So it's exciting to be back with Andrew Morton, a bit of a get. He's a very successful and very dishy royal biographer, perhaps the most dishy of all time with his book on Diana.
And really sort of changed the face of royal biography with his Diana book. And he's continued to be top of his game, really. Yeah. He produces the most amazing books. I'm a great admirer of his book on Wallis, which really broke new ground on a pretty well-known subject. But all his books,
people who don't know Andrew Morton, I'm guessing most people do, but he really came to international fame by becoming the chosen writer for Diana's own book, really. Well, she dictated or recorded an awful lot of it, which kind of completely broke open the story of the troubles in the royal marriage in the early 1990s. And he's gone from strength to strength. He's also going to talk about Meghan. And, most of the Meghan conversations we've had, especially with Valentine Lowe, it's maybe slightly negative, tending to listen to the voices that are critical of Meghan. I think he's a bit more positive about her.
Yes, it'll be interesting to get a sort of a counterbalance. I mean, he's based in America. He's based very close to where she lives. So I think we may get a slightly different perspective. I hope so.
Well, look, our producer told us to share more details of our lives. So if anybody's interested, and there is a connection to Meghan here, I joined a community choir during our little holiday, the one that Frances, my wife, goes to in Teddington. And we're rehearsing a wonderful Thomas Tallis hymn called If Ye Love Me, which is really quite a famous one if you're into choirs. So that hymn was played at Harry and Meghan's wedding, and that's the version we're trying to do. So the woman that runs the choir, Ruth, said, oh, you've got to have a look. see how it was done at the wedding. It's absolutely beautiful. And it does remind you, actually, looking at that kind of thing, just how positive and how hopeful that day was, and how people really loved her, and she knocked people out. She was a complete breath of fresh air. It is really, really sad how it all unraveled.
Well, I think the thing I find fascinating about royal biography is there are just so many different versions of real events, because we often know so little about them. I mean, though they're clearly well covered in the press, we get these different versions of actually what was happening in the marriage with Diana. We're getting different perceptions of Meghan. There is Andrew being able to say completely new things about Wallis Simpson after countless books. And I think that's what's really exciting. And actually what we're trying to do to show that history has so many different interpretations. And as long as you can back up your case, that's not a bad thing. Every generation reinterprets, I suppose.
Oh, absolutely. I think before we go to Andrew, a lot of people might be wondering why you haven't been dragged off in chains. Because before our break, hashtag Lowniegate was everywhere, but it was on our podcast. Any more developments in your clashes with authority, the spying on you, and your quest to get documents?
Well, no one's following around at the moment. They're probably listening in. They're monitoring us. That may be helping us. Maybe they're monitoring us from one of their stations in the Indian Ocean, and that's where we're getting
Republic.
Some of our people. No, so far not. But I'm doing a lot of talks now. I'm doing a talk this weekend on what's called censoring history, yeah, I'm continuing to rattle the cage. I mean, it's still. There's now going to be, they say, an investigation by the Met into the allegations by Virginia Giuffre. For a long time, they refused to say whether they actually did anything or were going to do anything. It now seems Channel 4 have persuaded them to do that. So that'll be interesting. That will open up the Andrew story. I think maybe there is a bit of a sea change in attitudes to official secrecy. There have been a couple of articles recently about the problems historians have had researching in Northern Ireland. And I'm hopeful that a big piece I've done, which is about to come out in the Royal Historical Society's journal about this, will perhaps galvanize some historians to stand up and share some of their stories of frustrations.
Yes. Well,
so I think it's an issue that runs.
Good. All right, then. Well, from one historian called Andrew who takes on the establishment, shall we go to another one called Andrew that does the same?
From one dishy to another.
Excellent. Here we go.
Well, we're thrilled to have one of the doyens of royal biography with us today. And probably, I think you've probably written more royal biographies than anyone else, actually.
Well, I think Ingrid Seward would give me a run.
Right.
But I think I've done quite a few. Yeah, it's a good point. I think I've written 25 books in total. My first book was called Andrew the Playboy Prince. It was written in 1982. Took about 3 weeks. It was about Prince Andrew at a time when he was a Falklands hero, a war hero, the most eligible bachelor in the world. You may remember when he ran down the gangway to meet the Queen and Prince Philip after the Falklands with a rose between his teeth.
And it ends on a very optimistic note about how he will go on to great things. I'm using it for my own book on Prince Andrew.
In a sense, he did.
And you're writing it now. You're doing one now.
I'm picking up the narrative. Yes, I've taken on the baton.
How things change over that period of time. I think somebody from the Observer who wrote a critique said it was probably the worst book ever written. So that's how.
Well, it's full of very good, useful facts and details for me.
Well, we thought today, if it's okay with you, Andrew, we'd talk more about royal women than royal men, because you've had your dealings and you've written about lots of them. I guess most famously about Diana.
Obviously Diana.
But we thought we could maybe work backwards in time and start with Meghan, since she's perhaps the royal woman, or the adjacent, semi-detached royal woman. It's getting perhaps the most comment at the moment. When you looked into her life, were you surprised at what you found, or?
Well, when I looked, it was extraordinary, really. I'm speaking to you from Pasadena in California, which is where my wife's from, and we live here half the year. And it was remarkable that she was literally the hometown girl. She went I'm sitting in my study, and to my left is a place called Pasadena Avenue. She went out with a chap there who is now a realtor. She learned how to drink tea with the Rose Tree Cafe. She was the homecoming queen in a place called La Cañada, which is just up the road. She starred in various plays and musicals at school. So for me, as an exercise in biography, it was, as to quote Eric Larson, low-hanging fruit. It was a question of walking out the door and somebody saying, "Have you spoken to so and so?" and people phoning in with their anecdotes about Meghan. And I've pretty soon realised that there was a kind of a Meghan paradox. That is to say, she had been successful in her own right as a woman. She'd spoken at the UN. She had her own website, the TIG. She'd made probably the last breath almost, because she was in her early 30s, a successful career in acting. So she was very much her own woman. And I think that women around the world responded to that. And I think that hence the massive disappointment that she and her husband, Prince Harry, have decided to leave the royal family. But the paradox is, in many respects, the fact that she'd made her own way in the world, but she had to give all that up in order to marry a man who had his position by birth, by dint of birth, not by enterprise, hard work, and initiative.
The more you found out about it, did you like her more or like her less, or just come to understand her?
As I looked into it, I thought she was a pretty positive addition to the royal family. I thought that she was, someone who would really yank it forward a few decades, and I think a lot of people felt the same way.
So where did it all go wrong? I mean, how do you apportion blame?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think that it all went wrong because of the other person. It didn't have an awful lot to do with Meghan, and just as the abdication didn't have an awful lot to do with Wallis Simpson, but they were both blamed for it. And Harry and Meghan's departure from the royal family was, by and large, Harry's own doing, because of his relationship with his father, but notably his brother, and a general dislike of being within the constraints of the firm. And we see the same, and yet when they leave, the vitriol is poured on Meghan. It's exactly the same with Wallis, that when Edward VIII, later Duke of Windsor, abdicated the throne, the hate mail was directed at Wallis, not at the ex-king. And it's an interesting parallel, really, that it's the women who are seen to be the ones who have the power when they don't, and they're seen to be the ones who make the decisions when they don't. And I found that the Wallis, and you know very well, Andrew, that the whole Wallis thing was somebody else was making a decision about her life without any discussion with the other person. So the king was making a decision to abdicate without any discussion at all with Wallis, and she, as you know, was looking for a slow boat to China, where she was in the south of France.
So, I mean, in some ways, the royal household haven't really learnt any lessons since Wallis. I mean, going back to the question of where it went wrong and who's to blame, I mean, as you say, it's Harry, but could you also apportion some blame to the royal household, because they, in some ways, didn't make them feel involved? I mean, they would argue they did, and they made every effort to include her, and she had a completely different agenda. I'm talking about Meghan here, who seems to be more active than Wallis in terms of what was happening.
I think that the issue for Meghan is that she didn't have a genuine clue about what was expected of her, even though the Queen had taken it upon herself to ask one of her senior courtiers, advisors, Foreign Office diplomats to speak to her. So that, for example, when the whole business of curtsying to the Queen, she thought it was like a pantomime show, that you did it once in public, but in private you never did it. Well, of course, a member of the royal family will tell you that you curtsy to the Queen or the Princess of Wales, as is now, and that's the format behind it. And I think that Meghan just didn't give it the thought that was required. That, you know, she's a modern woman who had her own agenda, and it really didn't match that of the royal family. And you say, should the courtiers have done more? Maybe they should, but also I think Prince Harry should have done more. I mean, he's as we've noted now, he is a great one for blaming everybody else but himself. But you know, he didn't take the time to get to know his new father-in-law, Tom Markle. Didn't get the time to fly over to California to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage. So there's, I think, when blame is being apportioned, the fair slab of it goes on to Harry's plate.
Do you think she maybe did bully her staff at all? I mean, we talked to Valentine Lowe recently about this, and he's obviously closely in touch with the so-called Sussex Survivors Club. Do you put much credence into that?
Well, I found it funny, really, that Diana, in the first few months of once the honeymoon period was over with the media, she was called by Nigel Dempster a fiend and a monster. She was criticised by Tina Brown as the mouse that roared. So it's the same pattern emerges, and it may well be true that Meghan was, you know, she was pretty demanding of herself when she worked on the TIG. She'd be up at 4 a.m, working out lines and contacting the couple of people that worked for her. So she was a fairly demanding boss. All that to be said, it's a different way of life working for the royal family.
And what does the future lie for the two of them now, do you think? I mean, they seem to be trying to develop an alternative sort of strategy. Well,
I mean, you just have to think of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. I mean, it's exactly the same scenario, that the Duke of Windsor in 1936, everybody was hanging on every word he said. By 1957, Tommy Lascelles called him a hearthrug bore because he went on about the same thing. And in a way, the caravan will move on from Meghan and Harry all too quickly. And the focus will be on Archie, the focus will be on Lilibet, and on the future king, Prince George. So they've got a few more years to spend in the sun, and then thereafter they will become secondary characters.
But how are they going to afford their lifestyle? I mean, you know, they have to produce income.
Well, they have to produce. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, their security detail is estimated to cost $3 million a year. The deal they got, you see, they were very fortunate. They basically got under the wire with Netflix and Spotify before these two media giants realized that it wasn't value to sign up every celebrity under the sun and expect them to produce something. And at the moment, they are, as the rock and rollers used to call it, it's a difficult second album, or in the sense that they've done the story about themselves, their love story for Netflix. That was a great success. He's produced his book, Spare, which has been an international bestseller. Not sold as many as Diana, Her True Story, but
Who
How has the
has?
market changed?
Who has, Andrew?
And so, yeah, I mean, they've got to produce a source of income. So they're following the template set by the Obamas, that they're using their contacts book to basically bring people in. But it depends on how good a journalist Meghan is, and by the standards of revelation, her archetypes podcast weren't particularly successful or revelatory. I think that I mean, they've got a mortgage on their house in Montecito, and you know, this is a critical time for them to earn some dough, because their lifestyle is not cheap. But all that to be said, California is full of billionaires, chock-a-block with multimillionaires, billionaires who love nothing more than to fate of Meghan and Harry at cocktail parties and so on. So, you know, back to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, they did the rounds of the east coast of America, south of France, and they made a handsome living out of it.
I mean, you said right at the beginning when we started that you liked royal women, that they're more interesting. Why is that? I mean, a lot of them are the outsiders who've come in some ways shape the monarchy. What is it that about them that makes them of interest to you?
Well, the answer is in the question. They see themselves, or they are outsiders, and they do have a dramatic impact on the royal family. Diana, as the Queen herself said, changed the royal family, changed the way that they behave in public and going forwards. Meghan, in the brief time that she was there, had made an impact, and could have had a more considerable impact if she decided to stay on. Obviously, with Wallis, we have the abdication, and who knows what the history of Britain would have been if Wallis had not been around. I mean, as you've written yourself, Andrew, I mean, you know, Edward VIII as king was way too friendly with the Nazis.
Yeah, and the Queen would only have come to the throne in 1972. So that would be a very different story. Because, I mean, you've just done a biography of the Queen. In fact, you've done several books on the Queen. The Queen
and her sister, yeah. And that steadiness, I think, has helped to preserve the monarchy. The fact that the Queen has, or did, sail through numerous conflicts and crises, started by her sister, with Group Captain Peter Townsend, then of course the first divorce since Henry VIII, and then of course the tragic marriage of Charles and Diana.
I mean, is it difficult to research these royal biographies if you're in the States? I mean, you're no longer quite so connected to the Courtiers, which presumably was a source when you were a journalist.
Well, the irony is that the Meghan, as I mentioned earlier, the Meghan book was very much low-hanging fruit, because I live literally where she grew up and where people knew her, had pictures of her, and had anecdotes. So that book virtually wrote itself. I spend enough time in Britain to be able to concertina a series of interviews with people in the UK when I'm over in London. So and that's and combine it also, as you know, with visits to National Archives, Churchill Centre, and so on.
Now, people talk about the Harry book as being a dramatic attack on his brother, and the Netflix series as being unprecedented. I would say none of these things comes close to Diana, her true story. But nothing that we've seen from Harry and Meghan, I don't think you can compare to a future Queen of England effectively briefing a biographer, your good self, with the most spectacularly surprising and shocking stories, which, of course, she sort of half denied telling you and then had to admit that she had. Those must have been remarkable days to be at the centre of that maelstrom. But in the years that have passed, do have you found out more about Diana to make you think that some of the things she told you were perhaps not the truth, or an exaggeration, or do you stand by everything in that book today?
No, I stand by obviously by the contents of the book, because it was what it said on the tin, her true story. It wasn't the true story. And I'll remind you of the fact that back in 1991, when we were deciding on the jacket cover and so on for the book, Diana wanted it to be called Diana: The True Story, and we had to argue very hard that it wasn't a comprehensive.
I never knew that. It's so interesting.
And so there are lurking in the archives at my publishers, Michael O'Mara Books in London, some covers saying Diana: The True Story, which, as I say, we convinced her against going down that road. But yeah, I mean, things have come out which surprised me. So, for example, her relationship with the art dealer Oliver Hall, married art dealer, was starting during the time that she was also talking to me about her failing marriage. So that came as a surprise. I mean, I do find, for example, that the Bashir interview, the famous Panorama interview, merely echoed what she said to me in terms of her doubts about Charles's fitness to be king, her wish to be a Queen of Hearts. But the phrase making, three of us in this marriage, Queen of Hearts, was better for Panorama. Better is the wrong word, but more striking than what she said to me for Diana: Her True Story.
So she practiced some of these phrases on you first.
Well, I think that towards the end, she had a bit of a shtick that she did invite various editors in for lunch, and people like Max Hastings and so on, and win them over with some kind of the same complaints and the same stories, and I think that the freshness came in her unguarded comments to me back a few years before, because she did things that she was talking about she'd never been asked about. So there was a freshness about her responses that isn't quite there in the Panorama interview.
And did you keep some stuff back just because of sensitivity for the children, or did everything she tell you used?
The only thing we kept back was she altered that when she threw herself down the stairs at Sandringham. It was the Queen Mother who came out to help her. Apparently, it turns out it was the Queen, and she didn't want to get the Queen involved in this particular story. So that was one thing. And another was the fact that she remembered quite vividly her father hitting her mother, Frances Shan Kidd, in a family row, and that was left out, but it was subsequently put in the revised edition.
I mean, you talk about going to the National Archives. I mean, one of my concerns is that the material isn't being put in the National Archives or being available to biographers. I mean, is that a problem that you've encountered or that you're worried about?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Andrew. I mean, we have two major biographies about to be commissioned, one on Prince Philip and one on Her Majesty the Queen. Who will be chosen? Don't know. Who's going through the archives? Well, apparently it's the Queen's footman, Paul Wybrew, tall Paul.
You're joking.
And
he's an expert historian.
It does concern me enormously, and are they going to be burning the letters like Princess Margaret did with the Queen Mother's correspondence, like the Spencer family did, like Sarah and McCorquodale and Frances Shan Kidd did with Diana's correspondence. They even burnt the ink jotters that she had. So this is always the problem, as you know full well, that the British royal family, and quite frankly, for that matter, all the German royal families. I mean, they've been far more ruthless in scouring the skeletons in their own cupboards because of their Nazi pasts. In Britain, George VI was very quick, as you know yourself, to send Owen Morshead, the librarian at Windsor, and a certain Anthony Blunt, Soviet spy and in charge of the King's pictures, to Germany to pick up letters relating to the Duke of Windsor's relationship with Hitler and the Nazis. So, you know, there's an awful lot that could be disguised, camouflaged, burnt, especially in a reign as long as the Queen's.
And I mean,
but should it be left to the families? Well, obviously they would argue that it's our mother, and it's our property. So and it's her, and the letters are her copyright. So it's a pretty seductive argument that they can.
Well, who's paying for the mother?
Well, exactly, but they wear different hats. They wear the privacy hat when it's about shielding correspondence and memos and so on, and then they wear the public hat when it's about cost.
I mean, the suggestion is that there won't be an official biography for some time because it's clearly got embarrassing moments in it.
Well, I think that the quicker the Queen biography is commissioned, the better, because the people who were her friends are all passing, all dying. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, you know, she was 96, so all her friends. I mean, many of her friends were dead in any case. But even so,
do you fancy the job, Andrew? Think they might give you a shot?
I think, Phil, that I would possibly be the last person on the planet to be given that job.
The two of us.
No, that's Andrew Lownie would be the last person.
The two Andrews. Yes, I think I'm behind you in the queue.
Yeah. But
I mean, how do you feel about it?
I've always thought it would be counterintuitive if they put an arm around my shoulder and say, Andrew, would you mind doing it? I mean, it would be the job of a lifetime. I mean, when you think about it, William Shawcross spent a number of years with his biography, official biography, which was the last one of the Queen Mother, and that ran to over 1,000 pages. That was a £4.5 doorstopper.
Do you support authorized books? This is the best way to control the narrative, to allow friends to talk openly, rather than just make the papers available and people have to, like you, find the people to talk to. I mean, it does seem a slightly odd thing to just say, well, you know, it's a bit like the Victorians, you know, we'll find some tame person to do the book.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I'm sure it's being debated now. I mean, who will be the chosen biographer? And I'm sure King Charles will have a lot to say about that as a well-read man himself.
Oh, please God, not Dimbleby. I couldn't bear it. Not Dimbleby again. That would be too much for anyone to bear.
But I think just to go back to your point, I mean, should there be an authorized biography? I mean, there's been dozens of unauthorized biographies of the Queen. So an authorized biography gives what is said weight, and it gives the people concerned, who are the remaining individuals who knew the Queen, license to be more as open as they wish to be. And as you know, I mean, I've done interviews with people who have said the Queen Mother is a wonderful person, but that's strictly off the record. So
I'm finding that. Yeah.
So in a way, you know, you've got to go down that road. I mean, obviously in America they have official biographers as well for presidents and so on.
And where do you think royal biography is going? I mean, do you think it's taken more seriously? It's moved into the hands of historians from journalists. I mean, you know, I've always been a great admirer of your book on Wallis, which had an enormous amount of new material, and Christopher Wilson describes as the best book on Wallis, and it is, I think. I mean, do you think that there's now a new seriousness about royal biography, that these things are not just the tittle tattle from journalists, but actually people are trying to get beyond that?
I think that's a very good point. I think that is absolutely the case, and certainly in my lifetime and my experience writing books is that I've come to them far more seriously than I did when I mentioned early on about Andrew the Playboy Prince. So for my part, I approach it a lot more seriously, and I think that the other aspect is that there are several American authors who, in that tradition of American journalism, which is quite serious and quite fact-driven, have written some people like Sally Bedell Smith, I'm thinking of specifically, some excellent biographies from the other side of the pond, as it were. And to go back to your point about finding the material, I'm sure you would agree that you find an awful lot of material, and this is what I find now, in America, at the Stanford Hoover Institute, Virginia Historical Association, the Boston Library. I mean, you mentioned the Wallis book, which I thoroughly enjoyed doing because I found an Aladdin's cave of information in the Boston Public Library, because a chap called Cleveland Amory, who was the former chosen biographer for the Duchess of Windsor, walked off the job because he couldn't stand her lying anymore, and he deposited his papers with Boston Public Library. And I, one cold January day, or week rather, spent a week going through he'd left something like 162 boxes because he became an animal activist, and it was, there were antlers heads and all bison feet and all kinds of stuff in these boxes. But I found all kinds of letters that had been written by Wallis to some of her friends, and it really gave a different vision of Wallis Simpson, and I'm very proud of that book.
Yeah, no, I think it's very, very fresh.
It also combined what I would call old-fashioned journalism. When I was doing the previous book, which was called 17 Carnations, about the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's links to Hitler and the cover-up of their papers and so on, I made friends with a relative of one of the Duke of Windsor's great friends, Herman Rogers, and she had all kinds of papers and information, and I really got into it, and it was, and she's still a friend now. So and this is where I always find writing books, is that somebody who's an acquaintance will often become a friend whilst you're researching the book.
Well, you're both very interested. Well, I'll tell you something interesting. I was lecturing on the Queen Mary the other day, and I said, we've not found anything to link Ribbentrop with Wallis, even though lots of people said they knew each other, nothing written. And the man came up to me at the end, he said, my grandfather was Ribbentrop's chauffeur, and he was always taking Ribbentrop to see Wallis. Now, that's second-hand information, but it's that sort of oral testimony that sometimes is there when the papers are missing.
That's and I also find that when you bring the book out and you're giving a talk, as you've just done, somebody comes up to you at the end and said, "Oh, do you know about such and such?" And you curse yourself because you wish you'd gone down that road.
Yeah, no, keep giving talks are good. Yeah, exactly. And what are you doing next?
Oh, I was going to say we're pretty much near the end. So love to know what you're doing next. I'd also love to know, we talked about all these women royal women that you studied. Which is the one you liked the most?
Well, it's got to be Diana. There's no, because it's a book that, will be the first line of my obituary. So it was
not when you write the Queen
book in many respects. changed my life, and also helped me to write future books, because when I rang people up, they knew who I was, which was great. The book I'm working on at the moment is provisionally entitled Winston and the Windsors. It's about Winston Churchill and his long relationship with the House of Windsor. And the argument that I put forward is that there have been lots of private secretaries and advisors to kings and queens over the centuries, but very rarely in fact, he is unique in advising and falling out with a royal house, a royal dynasty.
That sounds absolutely brilliant. We'll have you back to talk about that with a bit of luck.
Yeah, love to.
Thank you so much for your time, Andrew.
Thanks so much. I wish we'd gone longer.
All the best to California.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed that. Speak to you on. Take care.
Okay, speak to you on. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.